You'll recall from an earlier lecture that I indicated that validity is a concept that pertains to the form but not the content of an argument. Validity doesn't care what the meaning of the statements are in a given argument. In fact, it doesn't even care whether the statements are true or false, because when we test for validity, we just assume the premise statements are all true. And we ask ourselves, all right, if I assume these premise statements are true, is there any way that the conclusion statement could be false? And if we find just that one way, the conclusion could be false, that tells us the argument is invalid. And invalid arguments are not worth our time. They're not worth our time any more than broken clocks are worth our time, because they're not trustworthy. They're not reliable. So anytime we find an argument that's invalid, we just push that to the side and say, go try again. This was an unsuccessful attempt. But think about what's happening with a valid argument, right? A valid argument is one in which the conclusion is guaranteed to be true if the premises are true. Because when we assume the premises are true, we can't think of any way the conclusion could be false. Now, this is valuable to us, okay? So if I have a valid argument, I want to figure out if those premise statements are actually true statements. I determined it was valid by assuming they were true. Now I need to figure out if they're actually true. And when we get into this territory, we're talking about the quality of soundness, which is a quality associated with deductive arguments only, not inductive arguments. And when we say that an argument is sound, we're saying this. This argument is valid, and it has all true premises. Okay, so when we say an argument is sound, we're saying it is valid and it has all true premises. Every single sound argument is a valid argument, but not all valid arguments are sound. We may have a valid argument, but we've identified one or more of the premises that we think are false statements. And in that case, we'd say, oh, this argument, yeah, it's valid, good job on the form, but at least one of the premises is false, so it's valid but unsound. Okay, so all sound arguments are valid, but not all valid arguments are sound. Technically speaking, all invalid arguments are unsound arguments, but I've never understood the usefulness of that distinction. So we're just kind of do away with that and focus on this idea that all sound arguments are valid, but not all valid arguments are unsound. And arguments that we determine to be invalid, we're just not going to think about anymore. All right, so here you have on your screen 3 different arguments. And what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to determine whether each of these arguments is valid. And for any that you find are valid, ask yourself, are they sound? So for any of these that are valid, look carefully at both premises and ask yourself whether or not you think those premise statements in that valid argument are true. If they are, you'll have a sound argument. But if one or more of them is untrue, you'll have an unsound argument. And if any of these is invalid, just stop looking at it. It's not a reliable argument. It's that broken clock. All right? So go ahead and pause your video, look at these arguments, and when you're ready to check your work, go ahead and restart. All right. So let's look at argument number 1. It says, if we're watching John talk about logic on video, then we're watching a video posted to YouTube. We are watching John talk about logic on video, premise number 2 says. Therefore, we're watching a video posted to YouTube. Is that valid? Yeah. It is. Because if we're watching John talk about logic on video, then we're watching a video posted to YouTube. And we are, in fact, watching John talk about logic on video. It's got to be the case that we're watching a video posted to YouTube because of what the first premise says. So we know that when we assume the premises are true, that the conclusion follows with logical necessity. So this argument is valid. The question is, are the premises both true statements? Now, you know that premise number 2 is true, right? We are watching John talk about logic on video right now. You're doing that right now, okay? So premise number 2 is true. You might not know if premise number 1 is true or false. And I'm here to tell you that, yeah, premise number 1 is true. Every single video I've ever made where I'm talking about logic, I've posted to YouTube. And when you watch these videos linked in Canvas, they're YouTube videos that are embedded in your thought primer. So you're actually watching a YouTube video when you're watching a YouTube video right now. It's just embedded in Canvas, all right? So both premises are true, and then that makes this argument sound. It's valid, and all the premises are true. Now let's look at the second argument here. If a fish can swim, a fish can ride a bike. A fish can swim, therefore a fish can ride a bike. Valid? Yes, it is valid. In fact, this argument has the same form as this argument. We'll talk more about that in a few weeks. So this argument is valid. Okay, now the question is, are the premises true? Certainly the second premise is true. fish can swim. But the first premise is false. It's not true that a fish can swim. A fish can ride a bike. So therefore, we said this argument is valid, but it's unsound because the first premise is not a true statement. All right, let's finish up with the last argument here. If it's snowing, then the mail will be late. The mail is late, therefore it's snowing. Okay, so if we assume the two premises are true, does the conclusion have to be true? And we say, well, no. I can think of lots of ways that the premise statements could be true and the conclusion false. Okay, let's just say that we're going to assume it's true. If it's snowing, the mail will be late. Okay, mail truck can't get up the road fast enough because it doesn't have snow tires or whatever. But let's just assume it's true that if it snows, the mail is going to be late. And let's just assume we walk out of the mailbox and in fact the mail is late. Does that mean when I look around it's going to have to be snowing? And we'd say, well, no, maybe the mail truck got a flat tire. Maybe the mail carrier got bit by a dog. There's a whole host of causes for the mail being late. Snow might be one of them, as the first premise indicates here, but snow's not the only one. So it's possible for the conclusion of this argument to be false, even when we assume the premises are true. And that tells us this is an invalid argument. And because it's an invalid argument, we don't want to have anything to do with it. All right?